Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel, and I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So today we're kicking off a series looking at country case studies, and what better case study to start off with than the United States. So the United States is one of these countries that is very well known for being an immigrant receiving country. And we're going to start a series now where we look at a number of different countries, looking at the history of migration, the history of their migration policies, and then also the current migration situation. So in this video, I'm going to kick off with starting to talk about the history of migration to the United States, which is quite a rich and also tumultuous one. So let's first go back to the colonization period. So the United States was also a colony, and the colonization period started from around 1607 to around the 1790s. Now, the first successful European settlement was actually established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. So most of the settlers then also became farmers, and this was more out of necessity. And an interesting fact, a lot of the first colonies were actually established by companies and investors, and then only later were taken over by European governments. So what we saw in the beginning is that most of the immigrants came from Northern Europe, mainly from the British Isles, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden. We also saw that at this time many people also traveled as indentured servants. So in the first half of the 17th century, these people traveled on the ships. They came over to what is now the United States, but they didn't receive wages. They were transported to the New World at that time. They were given food, housing, and clothing, and then at the end of a specific period where they had worked off their debt, they were then made free to be able to do as they pleased. So the reason that people migrated at that time to the New World was really to look for new opportunities, profit-seeking ventures, and also for religious reasons, for religious freedom. Of course, also at this time, there were already some people living in the New World. They were Native Americans. And at this time, when the settlers came over, many of these people were also killed by disease and conflict, and many were also displaced. So we see different types of migration happening already in the early days of what is now the United States. Another forced version of migration here was also the Atlantic slave trade to the US, to other parts also of the continent, to North and South America. But in this case, I'll talk mainly about the slave trade to the United States, which started around 1619 when the first African slaves were sold at Point Comfort in Virginia. The majority of slaves were sold to planters in the more southern colonies and were predominantly from West Africa. So there was also at some point, so the slave trade went on for quite some time, for around 200 years, almost 200 years. And then we had the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves in 1807, and this actually stopped the international slave trade to the United States, but did not prevent the domestic trade of slaves. So we still have plenty of types of forced migration in this context going on during this period. At this period of time also, what you can see by this old map here is that really just the eastern section of the United States or the New World was inhabited. And we'll talk more about internal migration and migration from other areas with the expansion also out west in the United States. But first, let's look at the population in 1790. So this is information from the first census ever conducted in the United States, which happened in the summer of 1790. And here you can see the major immigrant groups in the United States at this time. Unfortunately, with the way that the counting was done, Native Americans were excluded from this counting, which is why you don't see them here. So this figure represents our best estimates that we actually have of immigrants and people from different descendants in the United States in the 1790s. And you can see the major groups here. So first the English, also those from Africa. Of course, this is coming from the slave trade. We have Scottish, German, Irish, Welsh, Dutch, French, Swedish were the main groups at that time. Then we have the period of the frontier expansion. So really the expansion from the eastern side of the United States to the western side of the United States. Annual immigration during this period actually grew quite a lot, from around less than one immigrant per 1,000 residents in 1820 to about 15 immigrants per 1,000 residents in 1850. So if we think about the frontier, the major frontier expansion period really happened over around 100 years, from about 1790 to the 1880s. And one of the reasons for this expansion and this internal movement also of migrants was the cost of travel also decreased. We saw increased networks. We had steamships at that time. So really technological advancement helped to increase migration at this time. We also saw that during the Civil War, so the number of immigrants decreased during this period. So in the 1860s, we saw fewer international migrants coming to the United States during the Civil War. But of course, there was also plenty of displacement, internal displacement because of conflict during that period. Now, if we move on to the period of industrialization, so here I'm talking about a period mainly from around the 1850s to the 1920s, we actually saw a very large immigration during this period. So particularly from 1880 to around 1920, this is often called the age of mass migration to the United States. So specifically between 1880 and 1914, about 20 million European immigrants arrived in the United States. And that was at a point in time when the US had around 75 million residents. Now, in 1850, over 90% of immigrants actually came from Northern and Western Europe. And I would say in 1920, this shifted a bit to only about 45% came from these, what we called the old sending countries. So we already started to see a shift in who was coming to the United States or which country of origin. The immigrants also from the South and Eastern Europe tended to be younger and tended to be single men who at least didn't intend to settle in the US at that time. We also started to see an expansion of different types of immigrants or people coming from different countries. So we also saw workers come from India, China, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the Philippines. And this was often as part of the California gold rush at that time, or especially in the 1850s. But they also mostly came as contract workers on government schemes and private contract laborers, and sometimes as merchants or as members of, as family members of existing migrants already in the United States. Around 1880, there were actually around 100,000 Chinese immigrants in the US, and between 1894 and 1924, there were roughly 170,000 immigrants from Japan actually went to Hawaii. So according to official statistics also on return migration, which the first data collection on this happened in the early 1900s, around 1908, around 30% of European migrants had actually returned to their country of origin. So it wasn't only immigration and settlement in the United States, but we also saw temporary types of migration with return also back to Europe at that time. Now here I will show you just a little clip, actually, from a contemporary Edison Film Company catalog. It's entitled Immigrants Landing in Ellis Island, and shows a large open barge loaded with people of every nationality who have just arrived from Europe, and they're disembarking at Ellis Island in July of 1903. So this actually gives you, I think, a nice idea of what it looked like at the time to arrive in the United States. If we consider this period of mass migration, or of a large number of migrants coming to the United States, here I actually want to show you a map of the United States in 1920, and this shows the ancestry of where people were coming from at these different points in time. So what you can see here also is that Scandinavians were the largest foreign-born group in the upper Midwest, while German-speaking migrants represented the largest share of foreign-born in the lower Midwest. We can see that Italians were quite prevalent in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, so really more in the Northeast. But we also saw a sizable number of people coming from border countries. So here you can see that Canadians represent a large part of the population around Maine and along parts of the northern border. And Mexicans really dominate the southern border area through most of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. And settlement patterns were, different in different parts of the United States. If you look at the southeast here of the United States, it's much more mixed from settlement patterns. Now, if we move on to the period in kind of post-1920, between 1920 and the 1960s, this was really a period of retraction, of less open borders than previously. The foreign-born share in the United States population actually declined from around 14% of the population in 1920 to around 5% in 1970. So that's a pretty drastic reduction. The immigration numbers had already fallen during the First World War, but the numbers really remained low due to more restrictive immigration policies, quotas, literacy tests, things like that were introduced in the 1920s. What we saw was definitely that the flow of low-skilled immigrants dropped substantially after 1921. Temporary immigration, especially among unskilled and agricultural workers, was also greatly reduced. We saw that quotas were set for each country, favoring Northern and Western European countries, or European countries in general. And the Immigration Act of 1917 actually barred immigration from the Asia Pacific completely. And you saw that was following the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and the 1908 Gentleman's Agreement to restrict immigrants from Japan. So there was actually very exclusionary policies during this time. Actually, during the Depression period and in the 1930s, emigration, so people leaving the United States, was actually greater than immigration, or people entering the United States. Then during World War II, we saw very specific immigrant groups, including Jewish refugees and Eastern Europeans came to the United States, which were able to do that because of the Refugee Act of 1953 that contributed to a kind of shift in the way migrants are selected or were selected. Now, there was an exception to these trends at the time, and that was temporary immigration of over 4 million Mexican farm laborers that were coming to the U.S. through what was called the Bracero program, which was in place from around 1942 to 1964. And this was the way that the United States was receiving a lower skilled labor at the time. Now, if we look at immigration in the U.S. since the 1960s, we see that the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 removed the country-specific quota system and also almost doubled the immigration cap from around from 150,000 immigrants to 270,000 immigrants per year. There was still at this time a preference for close family members of U.S. citizens and individuals with specific skills and employment sponsorship. At this time, also, refugee and asylum seeker numbers were a relatively small share of immigrant numbers, but also have increased over time. While there was an initial influx of migration from Europe, we really saw that Asian and Latin American countries have become much more dominant sending regions in recent time. In 2010, the foreign-born population reached 14%, which was actually a level that we had not seen since the 1920s. Estimates also suggest that around 650,000 undocumented immigrants arrived each year of the 2000s, and mainly from Mexico. So we have seen increasing numbers of irregular or undocumented migrants to the United States. And that's obviously for a variety of reasons, but mainly due to restrictive immigration policies in the United States. So here we can actually see in this graph the number of immigrants and their share of the total US population, really from 1850 to 2020. And what you can see is that the absolute number of immigrants had a kind of a peak in around 1920 and then reduced, but then has gone up exponentially since around the 1970s or so. But what's also interesting is that in general, the population of the US increased at that time, over time. And what we're seeing today is that we have a similar immigrant percentage of the population as we did back in the 1880s and early 1900s. So really, as a percentage of the population, we're not seeing extreme growth in immigration these days. Another thing that has changed over time, which you can see here in this graph, is the region of birth, or where immigrants are coming from. Well, you can see in the 1960s and 70s, new immigrants were mainly coming from European countries. Over time, we've seen more and more immigrants coming from the Americas and Asia, and slightly smaller groups, but also growing, from Africa. So we've seen more of a diversification in where migrants are coming from, with more prevalence from Latin America and Asia. In these graphs here, you can also see here we have 4 pie charts that show the top 10 largest US immigration groups in 1960, 1980, 2000, and in 2018. And you can see how the major immigrant groups or sending countries have shifted over time, with still obviously Mexico always playing a major role, but it has also been growing substantially between 1960s and the 2000s, as well as the category of other group has also stayed relatively large, which means that there are people coming from all over the world. Here, what you can also see is, as of modern day times, these are the estimates of the top 20 diaspora groups in the United States. Now, there are some often difficulties with the term diaspora and what is the difference between diaspora and migrant, as they are often sometimes discussed synonymously. So here in the graph that I'm showing you, the term diaspora includes individuals born in the country, as well as those who cited their origin or ancestry or religion or race, regardless of where they were born. So this is kind of the affiliation that people have with these people, also from their ancestry. And so here also ancestry refers to a person's ethnic origin or descent, or roots or heritage, or the place of birth of the person, or their parents or their ancestors that arrived in the United States. So you can see that there's a difference here in the numbers of people who were born in another country and those who are considered part of the diaspora, which is, the diaspora is usually a much more encompassing term of people coming from a specific origin. And you can see which countries here have these kind of the highest numbers, and you can see how the diaspora numbers also differ from the country of birth numbers, because the diaspora numbers show more what's happened over time. So you see Germany, Mexico, Ireland, the UK having, very high diaspora numbers, whereas more the Mexico, China, the Philippines, India are countries that maybe have more foreign-born people, or those people who were born in those countries and then immigrated to the United States. So let's shift now and talk a little bit about forced migration to the United States. So specifically refugees to the US since 1975. And here you can see that we've had very shifting origins of refugees. We've also had periods of spikes in when more refugees were coming to the United States. So you can see in 1975, here you had Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, resulting in an increase in refugees from Vietnam. So in this period, we had a larger number of Vietnamese coming to the United States. In 1980, you saw the U.S. Refugee Act, which raised the overall quotas for refugees. So you also see a larger number of refugees at that period. This graph also shows you where refugees are coming from. So you can see that there have been a substantial number of refugees from Europe over time, but also Asia and Africa, with fewer refugees from Latin America. And you can also see what's happening in modern day times and how the numbers have decreased in modern time, but I'll come back to that in another video. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. So in this graph, what you can see is the US refugee ceiling and admissions have declined in recent years. And this has very much to do with the Trump administration. But we already see that numbers had also dropped from the 1980s. And you can see in this graph both where the admissions are and where the ceiling was set at that time. What you see substantially is that when the Trump administration came into office, there was a substantial decline in the refugee ceiling, or the quota, the numbers that were allowed to come into the country in a given year. The U.S. has also trailed the rest of the world in refugee resettlement in recent years, so particularly in 2017 and 2018. And this was really after they had led for many, many years. So the U.S. has really been a leader in refugee resettlement, at least in absolute numbers, until modern day. And that's something that you can see quite clearly also in this graph here from the Pew Research Center. Now, one final graph that I want to show you that I think really nicely summarizes what we have been talking about in this video on the history of migration to the United States is this overview of migration from 1820 to 2012. And this is from Martin's work in 2014. And here you can see very clearly the different trends in migration. So for instance, in the early phases from around 1820 to 1880, it was mainly Northern and Western Europeans coming to the United States. Then during the industrialized period, you had more Southern and Eastern Europeans also coming. Then you saw this kind of retraction or immigration pause, where still the major countries of origin were Western Europe. And then really in the post-1965 situation, where you've seen much more diversification of migration and especially more immigration from Latin America and more immigration overall. So I'm going to leave that here right now. I'm going to continue this series looking at migration policy in the United States and then also looking at the current situation in the United States. So please have a look out for those videos. If you found this video useful, please like, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so that you can be notified when I've got new videos up. Please do comment in the description below also, and give me your questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. So I hope to see you guys next time. Take care.